In my entire life, I never thought of a day I would wake up and children are at home, being forced to stay in the houses, not to go out, not to purchase snacks, not to go to school, in as much as they miss their friends back in school and their teachers. It never really crossed my mind that one day I would wake up feeling as if I'm being denied my freedom of worship. I mean, who dares to lock the house of the Lord? Who dares lock the house of worship? A sacred place where we find hope, where we meet and strengthen each other. Who never thought, who ever thought, rather, that this would ever come to pass? Was I naive? I mean, out of those series and movies I've watched, did I ever just think that a lockdown was only in the movies? Did I ever really think that quarantine is only found in series and movies? Or this is just something made up? Was I really naive to think that? And months later, the pandemic hit hard. No one really ever saw it coming. I mean, we all thought it was a common cold going round, only affecting those whose immune systems were low or weak. Did I ever really think that the pandemic would go for years? Did I even think about the fact that it actually would be an endemic? And what happened to those working in corporates? What happened to mama mbogas? I mean, we were all discouraged from purchasing anything from the shops without wearing masks and without sanitizing. Most of us assumed that our next door neighbor and even our friends and families living with us were quite dangerous to us. I never in my entire life had a curfew. It all started at 7 p.m. We would all be indoors, and some of us mischievously would be looking outside the gates for the policemen who are trying to enforce law. We also saw individuals sleeping in their cars simply because the curfew caught up with them. Long story short, it all happened so quickly, so fast. We never really saw anything coming. Talk about retrenchments. Talk about people downsizing. Talk about people actually closing down their businesses. And it's unfortunate because in today's story, we talk about a friend of mine, late George. And actually, George was actually a very, very promising young man. You saw it in his eyes that he was going to make the best dad. He was going to make the best out of his engineering career. He was going to be the best man that ever existed. I mean, an ideal man. Working, nice house, nice car, very much God-fearing, never missed church any Sunday. And I mean, be it raining, burning hot, he was always ready to go to church. Mr. George grew up in a family of 4, and he was the second born. He grew up in a very humble background. You could say they never at any point went hungry, and love was all that they needed to survive. And George went to primary school, high school, and even campus, and he graduated, and off he was to start off his career. And who is God? He landed an amazing job, and back then 100,000 Kenya shillings was good money, which also came with other benefits like a company car and other allowances. I mean, immediately after graduating, who does not dream of such a job? I would say, or many of us would say and approve, that that is actually making it at that age of 25 years old. Let's fast forward to 2020. So 2020 is here with us. The first month is very okay. We are good. And I mean, after Valentine's, we're still okay. But on March, it hit hard. And that is when Mr. George lost his job. And I mean, he was promised that he would go back to work. Immediately, things got better. And we all know how it got. Mr. George lost his job. He was asked to stay at home with the hopes that things would get better and he would resume his life. We all can relate to the fact that it's not easy when you're renting a nice house in a nice neighborhood, a nice apartment. It's not always easy to downsize. And this is always because you are already used to that lifestyle. And again, what will people say? And so George stayed in his apartment for the month of March, April, and you guessed right, May. It wasn't until he wasn't able to pay his rent anymore that he was asked to move out as soon as possible, and therefore was given June as the last month he would actually be living in that apartment. And Mr. George was so stressed up. We all know how hard it is to actually go back home after moving out, staying on your own, making the best out of yourself. It's not easy. And everyone back at home is struggling. Your younger siblings are back at home simply because they can no longer go to school. And so what does Mr. George do? He decides that I cannot downsize. There's absolutely no way my friends will come and visit me in a dingy place. The company car is gone, sorry. The allowances are not there anymore. I can no longer afford trips to and fro. I'm just home. Home, home, home. And you might ask, why wasn't Mr. George saving? And I mean, when you first start working, is it even possible to save in the first year? Is it really? Or you just want to experience your best life first, and then saving comes later on? And so Mr. George lived in denial his entire time. It got to a point Mr. George could not afford food. However, a month later, in the month of June, he was kicked out and he was seeking help from a friend of his that had been a long-time friend from high school. Wasn't doing so well, but did Mr. George have an option as at now? Absolutely not. And so Mr. George joined his fellow friend. He was living in a slum, in a single room place, call it a Mabati house. Although his friend was quite happy with that, he did not mind at all. But Mr. George is not used to that kind of lifestyle. But he has to do so anyway, cause he cannot go home. And I mean, it's in the nature of men to want to be strong. It's in the nature of men to want to be the Simba, to not eat the grass no matter the season. And so Mr. George joins his friend. They become close friends, only to learn that his friend was actually doing drugs. And I guess it got to a point that he was actually selling drugs. And so Mr. George, when he hits one blunt, two blunts, and he's high, he forgets about all his problems. It wasn't until later that Mr. George was indulged into the lifestyle of that friend of his. Let's call him John. It wasn't until later that Mr. George got involved into some sort of stealing here and there to cater for his needs. I mean, you have to put food on the table. Let's go back a little. Since Mr. George had not cleared his rent, the landlord had to keep his staff at the store as security up until he pays up. As per rules, Mr. George gets into crime. I can never really get into details as to what was happening to him, as to what he did in the night to ensure that he actually put food on the table. All I know is he was trying to fend for himself. I mean, there is no work, there are no jobs at all. The children are at home. There's a curfew, for heaven's sake. Who and where do we depend on? The churches are trying as much as possible to give the little they can for lunch. If anything, during COVID, I can bet most of us opted to survive on one meal, if not two. Mr. George was facing a tough time. As many of us can actually approve, there was a time that get even 100 shillings from a place that you actually work was a problem. Or if you had like a business running, a customer walking in was only but a wish. And so Mr. George got involved in crime, stealing here and there. We do not know what else. And so he just happened to go missing. When Mr. George was discovered missing, the only person that they would actually question was his close friend, the one that he was actually living with at the time in the slum. And all he had to say was that Mr. George was actually in so much denial. He was still hopeful that he would go back to his normal life, to his job, to his company car, to all the benefits, the traveling, the whole package and everything that comes with it. Mr. George was in so much denial to an extent that he didn't believe that he was actually broke. And the more in denial he was, the more drugs he got involved with, let alone smoking, drinking. He got to a point of actually injecting himself with drugs. And as you all can remember, in the year 2020, none of us, most of us, did not go back to places we were working for. We started our own hustles. And right now, we can attest the fact that self-employment is almost always the best way to go, rather than depending on a contract. We all know where it hits hard. It has an end. It has benefits, but it has an end. It's a contract you sign. It has an end to it. And so, Mr. George is missing. The family is now involved in the search for their son. And so what do we do? 2 weeks later, Mr. George is found, and not in the same place, but a place far from where he had actually been staying. And Mr. George was found in a trench, overdosed, lifeless. And you can imagine the situation of someone in a trench. And that is how we lost a brilliant, prolific, promising young man who had so much coming for him, who had so much life for him, who had so much hope ahead of him. And if COVID taught us anything, and I keep repeating this, is resilience. Resilience is the ability to get out of a tough situation. It's the ability to bounce back. And just like any other situation, the first step to accepting a situation is actually recognizing the fact that you're actually in that situation. Is learning to live with it, learning to cope with the situation, coming up with solutions as to how you can get out of that situation. If not, coping with it. I'm really, really glad that most of us didn't give up during COVID. And I look back at some of the situations that Mr. George was into. At one point, he actually got a job that was actually paying him 40,000, but he wouldn't settle. He got proposals from individuals offering him 20,000, but he wouldn't settle. He just couldn't settle for that. Because you're dropping me from 100 to 40. and now to 20. I'm sure a wise person would have taken that opportunity. Someone that saw the need for that money would take the job. If Mr. George had not been involved in drugs, alcohol, the injections, and obviously bad advice from a friend, he would have made it. It didn't really matter whether he made it out of 2021 a drunk, provided he was alive. It didn't really matter whether he made it out of 2020 earning 40,000 a month. All that mattered really was the fact that a mother somewhere had a son. It was such a sad moment for all of us, friends and family of Mr. George, coming together to mourn a very young man at the age of 26. Who loses their life at that? What mom, what kind of friend wants to lose someone just when they turn 26? You bet right, none. How many times have you been in a tough situation and you actually came out of it strong? I can bet stronger, more motivated, with a different aspect, having learned a lesson. That is what we call a resilient person. And so, my friend, that's it from me today. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so every time I have an episode up, you are on the know. Have a lovely night, evening, afternoon, morning, depending on the time that you are watching this video. Bye bye.